Howdy folks, AJ here with PINDROP World News, and I'm just going to give us a brief introduction before we get into this conversation. So first of all, the conversation is going to be taking place between myself, my co-producer, Diego Austin, and the main guest, Dr. Ned Lazarus. So some context, as you're likely already aware, on October 7th, the group Hamas, based out of the Gaza Strip, launched an unprecedented attack against southern Israel. This attack included the breaking of security barriers and their own militants paragliding over the security barrier into towns in Israel. They reached as far as 15 miles outside of the boundaries of the Gaza Strip, took what is now estimated to be about 200 hostages back into Gaza with them, and there has been rocket fire exchanged between Hamas and their associates in Gaza and the Israeli forces ever since. Now, there are obviously a lot more complications there, including the fact that Israel has for about 2 weeks declared its intention to conduct a ground invasion of Gaza and eliminate Hamas. But we will save a lot of that for the interview. More broader context about the Arab-Israeli conflict might be warranted, though. It stretches back about a century or so, depending on how exactly you want to count it. And we'll start our brief recap with the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. Negotiated by Norwegian leaders and President Bill Clinton in the United States, this agreement laid out a provision that would allow the West Bank to be split up into sort of zones of shared control, with some areas being controlled fully by a Palestinian Authority, some being controlled fully by Israeli forces, and others having a mix of the two. It also laid the groundwork for what we see now in Gaza, where eventually Israel would completely hand over control to the Palestinian Authority. Now, that did happen indeed in the early 2000s, but an unexpected result after elections in 2006 for the Palestinian Authority in Gaza was the victory of the hard-right Hamas political group, which it should be noted is labeled by the United States as well as the European Union as a terrorist organization. After winning the election, Hamas kicked out the more moderate Fatah party that still to this day controls the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and assumed essentially full control over Gaza. A few years prior, Israel had removed its settlers who were in the Gaza Strip from the area and relocated them elsewhere, and essentially let the Palestinian Authority, or as it were now Hamas, have complete autonomy over how it conducted its own internal affairs. But they did strictly control access in and out of Gaza. So, what happens after Hamas takes control? Well, a lot of miniature wars take place. Hamas, whether you call it a terrorist organization or not, is a militant group, and they generally espouse a narrative of the river to the sea, liberating the Holy Land from the Israeli government and declaring an Arab-Palestinian state. As a result, there have been a lot of rockets exchanged between Israeli forces and Hamas forces, and it should be noted that a lot of these Hamas rockets, about 20% or so, don't actually leave the Gaza Strip because they are largely homemade or something close to it. Hamas militants have also launched incendiary balloons over the security barrier into Israel. The largest conflict between the two took place in 2014, but the most recent sort of flare-up or miniature war took place in 2021. Now, those miniature wars have been continuing, but what we're seeing right now, of course, is something unprecedented. Really a full-scale war, and the largest war fought by a Palestinian agent, a Palestinian entity, without the support of other Arab states. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not alone. They are largely believed to be supported by Iran, and there is an ongoing debate as to how much Iran was aware that this attack was going to happen and to what extent they actively supported this attack from happening. But it is broadly understood that Iran supports Hamas. It should also be noted with the timing of the attack, not only did it happen on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the last full-scale war that the region has seen, but it also happens as Saudi Arabia, the largest of the Arab countries, was just about set to declare normalization with the state of Israel. A lot of Arab states, in fact, most of them, still don't have formal diplomatic relations with Israel. And Saudi Arabia, being probably the most powerful of these Arab states and being culturally and religiously significant, housing the most important sites in Islam, well, it posed a big threat to the political security and balance of power from the perspective of Iran. So it is hypothesized, although not exactly sure, that this might have spurred Iran on to encourage this attack on the site of Hamas. Now, a lot of that's speculation, but that context established, let's get into the show. Diego, take it away.
Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to our panel. Today, we are interviewing Professor Ned Lazarus. He is a professor of international affairs at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University and a teaching fellow at the Israel Institute. He has evaluated peacebuilding initiatives for USAID, USIP, the Department of State, and the EU, and he was the Middle East Program Director for Seeds for Peace out of Jerusalem from 1996 to 2004. So welcome, Professor Lazarus. It's great to have you on.
Thank you so much, Diego. It's a pleasure to be here.
And of course, since October 7th, we've seen some very horrific events in Israel-Palestine. Civilians on both sides have died. And I spent about 8 months there. I've become quite familiar with the history of the conflict. And I mean, these are some of the most horrifying things I've seen on par with things like Deir Yassin and Sabra and Shatila. And I kind of wanted to get your own perspective on things that are going on, because of course the reaction, not just in Israeli and Palestinian society, but around the world, I think has been very polarized, and a lot of people are picking sides. But I think that you, as well as me, I think we have very unique perspectives in that we've both interacted quite deeply, both with Israeli and Palestinian society. And I mean, having been in that part of the world, I think that's a very rare perspective to have in that context. So I'm kind of wondering what your reactions have been to this situation.
As you said, this is, kind of murder of civilians on an unprecedented scale, even for a conflict that has been a violent conflict with a terrible history of violence, massacres, attacks that have killed civilians, both, let's say unintentionally in terms of military strikes, or intentionally in terms of terror attacks. These events are really unprecedented in scale. I lived there, as you said, in Jerusalem during the period of the Second Intifada, from late 2000 to 2004. And during that period, we saw the worst direct Israeli-Palestinian violence that had occurred since 1948, since the establishment of Israel, the Nakba, the dispossession of 700,000 or more Palestinians, the war of all the Arab states against Israel. So the Second Intifada was catastrophic, and it resulted in the loss of about 1,000 Israeli lives and more than 3,000 Palestinian lives. And that happened over a course of 4 to 5 years. And at that time, that, it was unprecedentedly horrible. So there were more than 1,000 lives lost in the first few hours. This began with a brutal and just massive scale attack by Hamas, which caught Israeli defenses completely by surprise. And then it's not an isolated terror attack. An Israeli general speaking to the radio yesterday said this really wasn't a terror attack. This was this was more on the scale of a military attack.
Mhm.
Several thousand people broke through all of the defenses that Israel places around Gaza, and then proceeded to attack towns, kibbutzim, cities in that area, and to murder civilians in their homes. More than, I think the death toll is now above 1,400 people in Israel, and the vast majority of those are civilians, as well as kidnapping 200 or more people. So this is sort of, if you took all of the attacks and massacres and hostage taking and that have happened over decades, but managed to do them in one day.
Right.
So this is an entirely different scale. The Israeli response so far is not different in kind from previous Israeli attacks on Hamas in Gaza or offensives against Hamas in Gaza, but it is on a tremendous scale, and it has already resulted in more than 2,500 deaths in Gaza, and that number has grown because of the strike on the hospital yesterday, which there are disputed accounts of responsibility for it. It does appear that there is footage that makes it seem that it was a failed missile attack by Islamic Jihad that hit the hospital in Gaza. But in any case, it is this horrible conflict that placed so many civilians in that hospital. So it is in the context that has resulted from the Hamas attack and the war that's come afterwards that led to so many people being in that spot. So what we've seen is again an unprecedented attack by Hamas, followed by a massive aerial bombardment by Israel, and we're already looking at fatality figures and casualty figures that are larger than a number of Israel's wars put together.
Right. And I definitely agree that this is unprecedented in the brutality and the amounts of deaths. But I do want to go back to you mentioning the Second Intifada, because if we're trying to predict how both Israeli and Palestinian society would react to something like this in the future, I think that's the closest thing we have. Because the Second Intifada saw Israeli society, I think, transition from a point where peace was seen as a possibility to the point where people became greatly disillusioned with that. And this, as we can see now, this has kind of spurred the rise of the far right parties like Otzma Yehudit and religious Zionism that are not conducive to peace. And on the Palestinian side, the Second Intifada was met with Operation Defensive Shield. And traveling in Nablus and Jenin, I pretty much interacted with young men who grew up in the rubble of this operation and felt equally disillusioned about the prospects for peace. And I think the anger and the disillusionments that both sides feel towards the other group comes from a very human place of pain and loss. And I think that this type of event would only intensify that. And I'm wondering, do you think, first, do you think there's even a remote chance of peace after the events we just witnessed? Because, even before that, people were quite pessimistic, and I'm not very optimistic to the future, to be honest.
So as you correctly said, during the 1990s, there were historic agreements between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, that led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority, the withdrawal of the IDF from Palestinian cities in the West Bank and from much of Gaza, and negotiations began on what was called the Final Status Agreement, a full peace treaty. And there were, formal relations established between Israel and the Palestinian leadership for the first time in history. So these, this was certainly a time of hope. This also led to a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, and to the establishment of some level of diplomatic relations with a number of other Arab countries. There was some momentum, and it seemed that the future could certainly, be more peaceful than the past. There were obviously events that led to the failure of that peace process, and Hamas played a central role in that as well, along with extreme right opposition in Israeli society. And in both cases of Hamas and of the extreme right in Israel, violent opposition. An Israeli extreme rightist assassinated Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister who had led these first moves toward peace with the Palestinians. A Jewish terrorist, Baruch Goldstein, murdered 29 Muslim worshippers in Hebron at a shared/contested holy site, the Cave of the Patriarchs. These had tremendously negative effects on the peace process. And Hamas, from the very beginning, escalated its violent opposition. Right after the Oslo agreements were signed, Hamas kidnapped and killed an Israeli soldier, Nachshon Wachsman, and by 1994, Hamas was already engaged in a suicide bombing campaign that continued throughout the 1990s and took hundreds of lives, as well as engaging in occasional violent clashes with the newly established Palestinian Authority, because Hamas's goal is to replace Fatah, its rival party, and the Palestinian Authority, and become the uncontested leader of the Palestinian national movement, and to lead it in the direction of Islamism. So there, every time there's movement towards peace, there is a backlash from powerful factions among both peoples who oppose that agenda, who have a maximalist agenda in terms of the territory, and often it's mixed with an agenda in which they'd like to see a more religious form of state. And so those parties, have in the past, and what we're seeing now may have some degree of that as well. Now, Israeli-Palestinian peace has been a remote prospect for a long time. As you said correctly, the Second Intifada and the horrible escalation of violence that occurred, the massive wave of suicide bombings, the massive Israeli military operations in the West Bank and Gaza. Defensive Shield was the largest one, as you mentioned, which this claimed thousands of lives on both sides and really destroyed trust, or a sense that they could live in peace. And at the same time, there were negotiations afterwards. This wasn't the final nail in the coffin, but it began a process, certainly where there was no longer trust in the intentions of the other side, and the parties that supported peace became less popular. But as we know, there's been a sort of different peace process or diplomatic process that has gained some momentum in recent years, and that's of normalizing relations between Israel and some of the Arab states that had previously not had official relations with Israel. So we know that the 2020 Abraham Accords led to normalized relations between the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Bahrain, and Sudan, maybe, because Sudan is an unstable country that's in the midst of multiple military coups, and it's not really clear. But the important ones are, the other three. So that was a major step. And then suddenly, in recent months, there had been a lot of talk about negotiations and the growing prospect of a normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And that would be it. That would be a major strategic development. Saudi Arabia is an enormously important and powerful, wealthy, religiously symbolic country in the Arab and Muslim world, and for Israel to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia would be a major step. The other accords are an important step, but not nearly the same level of importance as this would be. And so that is one of the possible motives. Many people have asked recently, why now? Why did Hamas engage in this, daring and horrifically deadly attack at this time? There are other motives as well, but one of the motives may have been to derail those negotiations with Saudi Arabia, which are threatening to Iran, which is one of Hamas's main patrons. In that sense, there would be nothing unusual about that. Hamas has been successful, again, with the, it's not like they talk to each other about it, but extreme right factions on both sides, have violently derailed, peace processes in the past. So that in that sense, it would be a continuation of that pattern.
And I certainly agree with what you're saying about the motives for this, because of course, I think Hamas knows that they're going to suffer very heavy losses. And I think they would have only done this if they felt like they were in a position where it would be worse not to, for their strategic goals. And I do think it probably is related to the Saudi-Israel thing. And now you mentioned the growth of extremist groups on both sides, especially after the Second Intifada. And I'm wondering, I think that Israeli and Palestinian politics are put in a strange position now, where I think I would normally predict, and I would now predict that these events are going to cause even more extremism on both sides. But at the same time, this is the first time in which these extremist groups on both sides, so religious Zionism and Osma Yehudits, and also I'm not equating them to this, but extremist groups on the other side, like Hamas, have been in power, and it hasn't really yielded positive fruit. So I'm also wondering if these groups would catch the blame, and I'm wondering what you think is going to happen in that regard.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There have been other. This is a different context, but let's say, in Egypt, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood won an election after the revolution that overthrew Hosni Mubarak in 2011, and sort of putting them in charge and giving them governmental responsibility was in some ways a good way for them to fail and lose popular support right away. And they were overthrown in a military coup, not in a democratic election, unfortunately. But that coup was at the time very popular among Egyptians and was supported. Unfortunately, it has been, led to just the reestablishment of the autocratic military regime, probably even more repressive than before. But unfortunately, that's been the pattern in almost any of the countries. We've seen it's really been a tragic time, the 21st century in the Middle East. Hopes for peace between Israel and the Palestinians, hopes for democracy after the 2011 Arab Spring, it's just been a tragically disillusioning time. That I've been following the politics of the region. Now, let's get back to your very good question. First, I think as you said, both obviously Israel and the Palestinians are very different political spheres. So let's talk about it one at a time. In Israeli politics, as you said, this attack comes when Israel has its most far-right government ever, which includes two parties who are, one party which was really banned from running for the Knesset for, most of recent history. Israel has a law that says a party that openly incites to racism, as well as a party that denies the legitimacy of Israel to exist as a Jewish and democratic state, those parties can be banned from running for the parliament.
On the Israeli side, you're referring to Kach?
I'm referring to Kach, exactly. Kach, Kahana Chai, any of those organizations. So Itamar Ben-Gvir is a Kahanist.
Yes.
He is from that movement. He is, he has been an activist in that racist movement, since he was a teenager. He is remembered for proudly attacking the limousine in which Prime Minister Rabin was driving, pulling the hood ornament off and then showing it off to the cameras and saying, "We got to Rabin's car, we can get to Rabin." This was a month before the assassination. So his background as an extremist is very long and clear, and he was, even the right wing, Prime Minister Netanyahu, even further right, would have nothing to do with him for decades. He was considered completely unkosher, even by people on the very far right. But Prime Minister Netanyahu, after he was indicted and went on trial, and he is still on trial for corruption, became desperate. And Netanyahu, tried to win an election so that he would maintain his status as prime minister, which is very important to possibly getting himself out of his trial. And it led to this period of political deadlock in which Israel ran 4 elections and each one had inconclusive results. And Netanyahu could not win, but the opposition also could not really win, because the opposition, they all agree they don't want Netanyahu, but they don't agree about anything else. And so there was this period, there were 5 elections run in less than 4 years. In the last election, Netanyahu learned his lesson, and he brought in the extreme right elements and demanded that they run together. And they were, his side was very disciplined. They didn't lose any votes. This is similar to Donald Trump, by the way, who also mobilized elements that really were considered, not legitimate for American politics before. And Trump and Netanyahu, have a long friendship. Now they're not friends anymore, apparently, but in any case, I certainly think they pay attention to each other's examples. So Netanyahu succeeded. This was a successful maneuver in terms of electoral politics. The left also, made some terrible strategic moves. Not the left. The left is very small. The center, center left. And so Netanyahu won, has a 64 out of 120 seat majority, which includes and depends on Itamar Ben-Gvir and, extreme right elements. And that government is extremely controversial. It was the minute that it was sworn in, but it actually made itself much more so by immediately trying to pass a massive set of package of legislation that it called a judicial reform, but is actually a change in the constitutional structure of governance in the country. And it would remove the only checks on the power of an elected government to do whatever it wants. And this turned out to be a colossal strategic mistake, because it provoked the largest sustained protest movement in the history of the country and essentially mobilized much of the Israeli population, which previously had been talked about as sort of apathetic and they've given up on politics. So it mobilized massive street demonstrations. At one point, a study found that at least 20% of the population of the country had protested against the government in the last month. And this hamstrung their attempt to get this judicial reform through. In the end, they've gotten one small piece of the legislation through, and even that is now in the Supreme Court, which may declare it unconstitutional. In any case, that that government was already extremely unpopular. Election polls that were taken before this attack showed that government losing if an election were held today, they would lose their majority very, very significantly. So they were already controversial, and already a large part of the population did not want to see their faces anymore. And now, after October 7th, they are responsible for, without any question, the worst failure in the history of Israeli government and military. They're not solely, and they will try to put the blame on, the army, on the heads of the security services, etc. I don't think that's going to work. I think that the public right now in Israel is very united around, the idea that they need to fight a war and they need to help all of the people who've been driven out of their homes and who have lost their families. There's a large mobilization of Israeli society. There's a lot of discourse of unity, but even within that, I'm hearing in the media all the time expressions of absolute rage at the government. Every time a minister is interviewed, even the journalists are after them, when are you going to take responsibility for your failure? And when ministers go around in the country, that's been happening for a while, but now it's still happening. People shout at them. They shout shame, shame, shame at them. So I don't. This is I do think this will lead eventually to the end of this government, and probably to, at the very least, Netanyahu being out of power. No one can ever eulogize him. He is the political equivalent of a zombie. Like, he can never be killed. He always comes back. But I think he's certainly going to have at least to be out of power for a while, and maybe worse than that, because this is a disaster. The Hamas attack, obviously, it's partially Hamas was both very disciplined and clever and strategic, and then also in ethical terms, just absolutely appalling, murderous. You can't use enough words for it, but the Israeli defenses completely collapsed. It's a stunning failure, a dangerous failure. It invites other parties such as Hezbollah or others that are hostile to Israel to try their hand at the same thing in the future. So and Israel is a country obsessed with security. So I don't see in any way how Netanyahu and this government survive. The previous example, the Yom Kippur War, in which Egypt and Syria managed a massive surprise attack that broke through Israeli defenses, shocked the country, and caused hundreds of casualties right away. That is considered before October 7th, that was considered the greatest failure in the history of the state. And this year was the 50th anniversary, and the Israeli media was full of interviews and investigations, and so that 50 years later, that was still something people were talking about, and that led to the collapse of the Labor Party's dominance over Israeli politics. So I absolutely think, as you said, that in whatever happens in the war, and we have no idea what's going to happen in that war, this is going to lead to the end of that government. I do not know what's going to replace it. I don't know what's going to replace it. Do you want me to pause, or I like about the Palestinian?
Yeah, I mean, first, also. I think that was a very good assessment. Because I think a lot of people haven't really thought about what this means in the context of what was happening with the reasonableness clause. And I think the next people Bibi was turning his head to was largely the military apparatus. I think he was looking at Hirsi Halavi, at David Bernea, at Ronan Bar. The heads of the military security apparatus were quite against his agenda. And I think there's going to be a big blame game after all this. And I mean, I think it will have huge implications for the future of Israeli democracy. And I mean, hopefully Bibi's side will maybe not come out on top of that. So I think it was interesting that you went on that. And I think the Palestinian side will be very interesting to explore too. I mean, I think this might be the end of the Palestinian Authority, which might be a bold claim, but I've seen these big protests in Jenin and
Yes.
even Ramallah, and I think live ammunition was fired, and they're already very unpopular, and it's hard for me to see how the Palestinian Authority comes out of this as something more than just being viewed as a puppet. I wonder if you have a similar assessment.
So absolutely, Diego, you know the political scene very well. So let's talk about the Palestinian context. Before, again, we'll start with the before this attack. So before this attack, when I would try to explain, when I teach about this conflict and I try to teach about Palestinian politics and society, I usually say, many Palestinians that I know say that they have three governments, none of them are elected, and they hate them all. And it's a good, it's a nice joke, but it's a horrible feeling that their lives are controlled by three different parties that they feel in varying degrees and for various reasons, that they didn't choose, they don't have any influence over, and they don't like. And none of them are helping most of the Palestinian population or really representing their interests or goals. So one of those is, of course, Hamas, which has been ruling Gaza since it expelled the Palestinian Authority in 2007. One of those is the Palestinian Authority that has civil control and military, or whatever, security, so policing control over 18% of the West Bank, albeit all in separate islands of territory around the major Palestinian cities, and then another 24% has civilian control. So it has control to some degree of the lives of most of the Palestinian population of the West Bank, but not of the territory which Israel controls. And Israel controls, about 60% of the West Bank, including all the settlements, the major roads, and the area in between the Palestinian cities. But the Palestinian Authority, which is the Fatah party, the Yasser Arafat's party, the party that the world recognized since the early 1970s as, quote unquote, the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. So that party, which was dominant in Palestinian politics for many years, found its first serious challenger in Hamas. And they represent very different nationalisms. Fatah represents a sort of classic, secular might be the wrong word, but certainly not religious in an ideological sense. Traditional Arab nationalist party seeking to establish a Palestinian state since 1988 to 1993 or so. Fatah has recognized the UN resolutions 242 and 338, and therefore recognized the existence of Israel on 78% of the territory, meaning and has declared essentially that its objective is a Palestinian state in the 1967 occupied territories: East Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza Strip. Hamas has never agreed to that. Hamas's goal is the establishment of a Islamist Palestinian state on 100% of the territory of Mandate Palestine. But Fatah was the dominant party. It remains the dominant party in terms of its institutional control in the West Bank and in terms of its international status as the PLO. However, it's, as you said, become increasingly repressive. It has not held an election since 2006. And it is seen as corrupt. Its leaders are largely very old. Mahmoud Abbas is, I believe, 87.
He is 87, yeah.
It is in no way a popularly supported authority or government at this time. And Hamas's goal has been to undermine the Palestinian Authority and to become the undisputed, leaders of the Palestinian national movement. Hamas will make its case on this attack, and will say, the resistance, as they call themselves, has inflicted just revenge on the occupiers, the Zionists, and is more effective than the Fatah approach of negotiating with Israel when Israel has moved so far to the right and has expanded settlements in the West Bank and has prevented a real Palestinian state from even being a feasible possibility in the eyes of most people. So Hamas, will see this as a tremendous achievement. And I think Hamas will also see a surge in popularity among a portion of the Palestinian public. I think when you look at Palestinian public opinion polls, you get about 25 to 30%, I'd say, Hamas, supporters. You also get probably 30 to 35% at this point, Fatah supporters. Loyal, identify as Fatawi, as this is Fatah is my movement. You would have had more in the past. And you get an increasing amount, sometimes larger, that say none of the above.
And I think that's kind of manifesting itself in the formation of these new militias, like the Lion's Den, in
Yes.
that aren't very ideologically aligned. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The Palestinian Authority has been fragile for a long time, for years, with no prospect of getting anything significant in negotiations with Israel, and with Hamas, touting itself as the classic, revolution until victory. We are the party of resistance. We, continue to fight the war against Israel. It's become very fragile, and as you said, there were demonstrations against the authority in the streets yesterday, and I saw in the center of Ramallah, which is the capital. It's the de facto capital, and it's the place where the authority is strongest. So there were big demonstrations, and they were using the classic chant from the Arab Spring. The people want the fall of the regime. So this is this. I've been wondering for a while what's going to happen. I mean, I thought maybe Mahmoud Abbas will die. He's 87. I don't wish anything ill on anyone. Will resign because he has a stressful job, and maybe he doesn't want to live the rest of his life like that when there's no prospects of anything good happening. Or he will be overthrown because maybe people will get fed up, and there'll be a rebellion against the Palestinian Authority and against Abbas's leadership. He was elected in 2005, but that was 18 years ago. So an entire generation of people has grown up and is now voting age, but there has never been an election. But in any case, no one knows what happens after Abbas. It's assumed that they will try to pass power to one of his closer supporters, but there's no one who really has a popular following. There's no one who has much legitimacy among the Palestinian public. The only Fatah leader who really has popular support is Marwan Barghouti, who is serving life sentences in Israeli prison because he was part of orchestrating suicide attacks against Israel during the Second Intifada. So when you look at Palestinian election polling before this attack, they would say if there was a presidential election between Ismail Haniyeh from Hamas and Mahmoud Abbas from Fatah, who would you vote for? So these changed, over the years, but there's been a very strong pattern recently. Ismail Haniyeh and Hamas wins, defeats Mahmoud Abbas in head-to-head presidential voting. And that's been a pretty sustained pattern in the last few years. However, if you ask if the election is between Marwan Barghouti of Fatah and Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas, Marwan Barghouti actually wins. And more people say they would vote for him. And that is one of Hamas's sort of glaring weakness in terms of its bid to become the leadership of the Palestinian national movement, is that the majority of the public are not Islamist. And they don't want to live in that kind of Palestinian state. That is it. I would say that is its largest weakness, and it is not a majority party. Its ideology does not represent the majority of the Palestinians. There are some Palestinians who support Hamas because they believe in the violent resistance, quote unquote, or they don't like the idea of the two-state solution. They don't like the idea of negotiating with Israel. So there are some people who are sympathetic to Hamas for that reason, but even many of them really wouldn't want to live under a Hamas-style government. So that I'd say that's its largest weakness. And also, the longer it's held power in Gaza, it used to have a strong card that the Fatah and Palestinian Authority were viewed as corrupt. Only their cronies get jobs, get money. You have to pay them off. They were viewed widely as being corrupt. They're still viewed widely as being corrupt. Hamas won an election in 2006, and part of its win was the sense that, they're not corrupt. They're straightforward. I don't necessarily agree with their ideology, but at least they're not stealing money from the people. But, 16 years after they took over Gaza forcibly and drove the Palestinian Authority out, I think the same percentage of Palestinians thinks Hamas is corrupt, including in Gaza. When they take public opinion in Gaza polls, many people say Hamas is corrupt. So Hamas no longer has that sort of appeal. And the question then is, what about this attack? In previous times, when Hamas has, engaged in, a war with Israel, or launched thousands of missiles on Israel, and then Israel has, done airstrikes or attacked Gaza and killed, hundreds of Palestinians, or sometimes more than 2,000 Palestinians. Hamas would usually see a spike in popularity, sort of in the immediate aftermath or during the time of the conflict. But then after a couple months, when the devastation in Gaza, became apparent, when nothing really changed, Hamas's popularity would go back down again. So that's a question. I imagine that their popularity will go up as a result of this attack, because there's a portion of the Palestinian public that's just so angry at Israel for the occupation, for all the for everything, that they identify with this kind of attack. Now, I want to be clear. I know many Palestinians, and I know there are many Palestinians who are also horrified by what Hamas has done in this case, and maybe more so than ever. But just speaking in terms of political analysis, probably their numbers will go up for initially. But whether that will be sustained, I don't know, because the devastation that this creates for ordinary Palestinians in Gaza is so, so tremendous. And I guess in part it will also depend on the results of the war. That we really just don't know. But I would just say that Palestinian politics, we really didn't know what was going to happen next in Palestinian politics. Anyway, I've been saying that for years. What happens after Abbas, we don't know. We still don't know that, but now we're probably much closer to the tipping point.
Right. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, on one hand, we have seen pro-Hamas rallies, and there was a big one in Nablus. Our recent guest, Avi Melamed, who used to be in Israeli intelligence, made an interesting point on his Twitter that I think he was referring to Hamas's brutal treatment of Fatah and other things they've done, that there are a lot of people in Gaza kind of waiting in the corner for Hamas to fall quietly. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. And now for the rest of the interview, I mean, we have gone, it's been, we have been pretty lengthy so far, which I think is good because we've covered a lot of good things. But for the sake of your own time, I'm kind of just wondering, maybe I would like to ask a question about the prospect of a ground invasion of Gaza. And if we have time after that, if we don't, it's okay. If we have time, I would like to see if you think there's any sort of like what can be done for peace in the future. And that's kind of what I'm thinking to do for the rest of it, if that's okay with you.
Sure. So the first question is a very difficult one. The first question that you asked was about a ground invasion.
Yeah, because from what I'm thinking is, from my perspective, after seeing what Hamas did, I mean, the only way I could really describe that, it was like genocidal. It was like extremely.
I think this is technically correct under international law.
It was the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, I believe, and I don't see a way in which Hamas and peace can coexist. And I personally think that Israel is justified in pursuing a ground invasion and dismantling Hamas in Gaza. However, I am opposed to the mass bombing campaign that was conducted, because I mean, seeing Yoav Galant's statements before that makes me feel like it might have been motivated by heightened emotions, which I think is a very human thing. But it seems like it killed a lot of civilians and didn't really accomplish much. And of course, a ground invasion is going to be quite costly, but I also feel like I think Hamas has to go after this. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on this.
So, I mean, you've articulated things very, very well. The entire situation is so far away from, let's say, I worked for Seeds of Peace for many years. I teach peace and conflict resolution. I have hundreds of Israeli and Palestinian friends. I have family in Israel. I care deeply about Israel. I don't think that you can care about Israel without caring about the Palestinians. I think that's as completely myopic thing if you do, because only if the Palestinians can find ways of feeling that they live safely, with chances at prosperity and peace and expression of their identity and self-determination. I think that's the only way for Israel to achieve a greater degree of peace. And it's something that I've dreamed of and worked for. This situation is so far away from any of that first of all, I think it's just important to say that. And this question of whether or not there should be aerial bombardment and whether or not there should be a ground invasion. First of all, it isn't the question that I wanted to be asking, because if you were asking me what I want or hope for, the answer would be none of the above. So I do just want to say that very clearly. And then I think also, as an analyst of what's happening in the region, and just as a person trying to be forthright, we have to deal with reality as it is, and we have to. I can't run away from the responsibility A friend asked me, about this, on Facebook. I think I may have posted something, and they said, well, what would you do if you were the prime minister? So first I laughed. I said, no one with my views could possibly be elected prime minister. But let's say there was a utopian world in which someone like me could be elected prime minister. I still have to answer the question. I have to be honest. And that's it's very painful, because the things that I'm talking about are quite likely, if not inevitable, to lead to the deaths and harm of people that I know, or their families, their family members, Palestinians in Gaza, Israelis who will be, called up, who have already been called up and mobilized to fight in the war, and possibly Israelis who will be attacked by Hamas in other ways. So it gives me only sorrow, really, to talk about this question, and nonetheless, that is the question we have to answer. All right, sorry for that very long introduction. I certainly believe, and I've read a lot now. I've read things by other people, Israeli peace activists, who've spent their entire lives, working to avoid this kind of situation and prevent it. One of them, Gershon Baskin, someone who's conducted dialogues with Hamas leaders. He's been working for peace since, the first Intifada. He said, this has, completely shifted the paradigm after what Hamas has done. It is no longer possible for me to think of, Hamas as being fit to govern Gaza, and to maintain control of territory and to maintain military capabilities. And I think that is, that's correct. Hamas had agency here. They had strategic choices. Hamas had an incredible success from its point of view. It broke through the Israeli defenses. It surprised Israel. And Hamas could have broken through and only attacked military targets. I myself personally, I know I have many friends who have served or serve in the Israeli military. I don't want anyone to be killed in this conflict. It's not what I'm for. But many people in the world would say it is legitimate for Hamas to attack Israeli military targets, because they see Israel as blockading Gaza, occupying the West Bank, etc. And so they would say this is legitimate. Hamas could have done that, and scored an incredible strategic success from its point of view, without harming a single Israeli civilian. It absolutely, it had the freedom to do that. It had it's an important thing to emphasize. You have to stare this in the face. Thousands of Hamas fighters and Islamic Jihad fighters took that opportunity to murder people in their homes. And as you said, that is, first of all, that is probably genocide under definitions in international law. Even if it's not, that sort of doesn't matter that much. That's just a word people like to throw around at this point. That is no longer, there's no government in the world that could not respond with whatever force it can to an attack like that. And that is very clear. And it's resulted in unprecedented support, at least at the level of state governments in the West, for Israel. Governments that previously were very critical of Israel, of the occupation, of the policy towards Gaza, etc., are now very clearly affirming its right and duty to respond to that. And I wholeheartedly agree. There is no state that would tolerate an actor of that kind, building up an arsenal and controlling territory on its border. Now, the question is what? And it's a series of very bad choices because of the nature of the Gaza Strip and the fact that there are 2 million people living in this densely populated area. Egypt doesn't want them, pouring in as refugees. Israel doesn't want them pouring in as refugees. And Hamas builds all of its tunnels and command headquarters and arsenal and everything among the civilian population deliberately. Of course, you can say there's not a lot of space there. It's just 21 miles by 5 miles. That's true. On the other hand, there is agency there. They're in control of the territory. They could tell people to move because they're building, they're hiding some missiles here, or they're building something here that they know Israel will want to strike. They don't do that. And the reason they don't do it is because it makes all of these choices incredibly painful and ugly and difficult. So you mentioned about the aerial bombing campaign. We know that it's killed more than 2,500, maybe it's getting close to 3,000 Palestinians. We have no way to know how many of those are Hamas combatants or civilians, but we know that many of them are civilians. A ground invasion. So the aerial bombing campaign can do that. It can cause devastation. It can destroy buildings, destroy infrastructure. It can kill many people, but it hasn't removed Hamas, and it won't. There have been aerial bombing campaigns before. In order to do that, Israel will, as far as I can tell, need to invade. And that is not, I've now read some very intelligent pieces by people who are probably smarter than me, saying not to invade, that this will be, so Mark Lynch at GW has written one. Someone named Alan Johnson has written, he's more sympathetic to Israel than Mark Lynch. But he also has written, he said he thinks a ground invasion will be a disaster and will be contrary to Israel's interest. So the reasons that a ground invasion, they're quite real. Hamas has been preparing. Hamas obviously knew that it would probably trigger a ground invasion by launching such a massive attack on Israel, and that may be their goal. So they're prepared to inflict heavy casualties on the Israeli army, which both bolsters their image as an effective resistance organization in Palestinian eyes, and also just, again, causes more death and mourning and loss for Israel, and loss of deterrence also. There will be many civilian casualties, although that is true of all of Israel's military options in Gaza. And maybe the most negative is that, let's say Israel succeeds. It essentially removes Hamas from power. It makes Hamas no longer able to effectively be the governing power in Gaza or constitute a major military threat to Israel. At that point, Israel has reoccupied the Gaza Strip with 2 million Palestinians. In 2005, 18 years ago, Israel deoccupied the Gaza Strip because it had occupied the Gaza Strip since 1967, and that had been such a catastrophic situation. And at the time, in 2005, that was a very popular move in Israel. The majority of Israelis want nothing to do with Gaza. And of course, in many ways for Hamas, that situation might be more comfortable. Returning to being an insurgent group fighting against an occupying power. That's, maybe we would say, their wheelhouse. Being the government of Gaza actually maybe hasn't been so great, because at different times, they have been subject to people who are discontent because their lives are not good. And yes, they blame Israel, but they don't only blame Israel. So in many ways, there are multiple negative repercussions of a ground invasion. On the other hand, and again, I am not a military expert, I don't see how you remove Hamas from power without doing that. If there is another way, that is wonderful, and I would take it. But I don't know what that other way is. And I don't think that tolerating this, returning to the status quo, I certainly think from an Israeli perspective, that is also an intolerable outcome. There are many other things we don't know. We don't know if Hezbollah will launch an attack on Israel. And Hezbollah is much more powerful than Hamas, at least that's what we've been told. So that will change, that will alter things very significantly. And I imagine that, in the discussions between Biden and the American team and the Israelis right now, and in the discussions within the Israeli leadership, those conversations are, what are being talked about right now. So I agree with you. I think that there is, there are very strong reasons why some kind of ground invasion would seem necessary or warranted, though it comes with many risks. Again, if people have an alternative that doesn't just leave Hamas, in power, having done what they did, then, I would certainly, want to hear that alternative.
And I guess to wrap it up, my last question would be, from the perspective of someone involved in peace-building process, I mean, what do we do from here? Because in my time, just studying about conflict resolution and going to different societies, experiencing ethnic conflict that have experienced it, I don't know if I've seen a situation as bad as this since maybe like the Balkans or like the Ushaja or something. And I don't really know what you do from here. And even the Balkans is a bit different because I think Daytona was kind of like the first. Their peace building process kind of worked, not perfectly, but in the sense that it kind of ended up eventually reducing violent ethnic conflicts in the region. Whereas in Israel, they tried that and it didn't work and things have gotten worse. So I'm wondering what do you do from here? I said Daytona, I meant Dayton.
Yeah, the Dayton Accords. Yes, no, that's excellent. Thank you for bringing that up. So I think it's very good to look at other examples of conflicts that have some analogies to this conflict. Of course, they're all very different, and it's not you can't take a solution from one and transfer it to the other, but you can at least look at other cases. So right now we're in the middle of the worst bloodbath that has happened between Israelis and Palestinians. It's even worse than the Second Intifada already. We also talked about the weakness of Palestinian governance and institutions and the lack of legitimacy of the two major parties. And when I say that more people prefer none of the above, like Palestinians, the problem is that none of the above that's not a movement. Doesn't have institutions. That doesn't have an ideology. That's not able to take over a government and create an effective system. And that's what we saw in the Arab Spring, unfortunately. Mubarak, corrupt, autocratic government. There's an inspirational movement, popular movement, demonstrations sustained that eventually leads to Mubarak leaving power. And a lot of that movement is led by people who are liberal, who are fighting for democracy, who want a democratic government. But they are only a small part of the population, and they are not a strong, organized political movement. They don't have the numbers, they don't have the institutions, they don't have all kinds of things. So when there are elections, they don't win the election. The election is won by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a movement with a strong ideology, with very large institutions, with powerful international backing and resources. That's who has a coherent political program that they can impose. So in Palestine, again, there's all these none of the above people. And maybe leaders will emerge. Maybe these things will emerge over time, but they aren't there now. You have two groups that are organized political movements that can, contest, and those are Fatah and Hamas, even if most people don't want either of them at this point. So that's a vacuum. That's a really, that's the glaring weakness, I would say. So what happens next, we really can't say, because we just don't know what is going to be the Palestinian political scene after this. Here's what I would say when you bring up the other examples. The best case scenario, I think right now, I'm not talking for the long term, would be if somehow this conflict could go from being brutal, violent powder keg, a volcano that can explode anytime and claim thousands of lives, to something like, a frozen conflict, like the Balkans or Cyprus. So nobody's happy with the situations there. You don't hear anything glowing about the Dayton Accords. Cyprus, they never negotiate a peace treaty. Nobody's happy about how things are. It's not in any way an ideal, but the violence is either completely over or is at a very, very, very low level. And when, in the case of the Balkans, from genocidal levels of violence to very little violence. Northern Ireland is another example. That might be the best case scenario. But I think the problem with that is that Northern Ireland exists in a peaceful and prosperous, affluent region of the world and has no outside parties in any way that support conflict. So that's one of its great advantages. That's not to take away from the depth of the conflict there, which I know Diego knows well, which once you start to study it, you realize that conflict was every bit as hateful and ugly and violent as anywhere else in the world. But it is just in a better region. The Middle East is not a region like that, and there are very powerful, outside powers that do not want to see this conflict resolved and want to see it remain on essentially a zero-sum war between national movements that don't, it's either one or the other, and we're backing, so that makes it harder. But the best case scenario would be, I think, some, to reach that level where at least, violence was low, and there was, to do that, you're going to have to create some kind of, Palestinian political expression, self-determination, government. You have to do that. And what we've now seen is that really can't be Hamas, which is one of the two options, and maybe the more popular option in a small, in a certain way at this point. So, it's very difficult. In the Israeli scene, I'd say there are not contradictory, but there are two different responses to massive escalations like this. You saw this also in the Second Intifada. On the one hand, the far right can be strengthened, and certainly feelings of hate and anger and distrust rise astronomically. And Israelis will say, well, certainly we can't ever have peace with them. But there's another response as well, which could be conducive at least to a sort of separation, which is that Israelis also, when this kind of thing happens, feel like we don't want to live with them. So, and we don't want to be in Gaza, and we don't want to be in the West Bank. And, you know, there is a portion of Israeli society for whom the West Bank is sacred territory and is ideologically important. And that's it's a powerful minority, but it is a minority for now. You know, that may change in the future. You know, so the second Intifada was horrible, destroyed Israelis' trust. Nobody voted for left-wing parties anymore. They didn't think peace is possible. But there were serious negotiations right after that. There was a withdrawal from Gaza. It was very popular. Ariel Sharon then ran an election on a program saying, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to unilaterally withdraw from 90% of the West Bank. Our border is going to be the separation barrier. They won that election resoundingly. Ariel Sharon died of a stroke. And so they didn't even have his sort of, you know, charisma, if you know, you can say that. You know, Ehud Olmert, who's not a very charismatic or popular leader, still won the election resoundingly on that political platform, saying, I'm going to withdraw unilaterally from 90% of the West Bank, wins the election. So that shows that that response also, it's not because he didn't say, I'm going to make peace. He just said, I'm going to get us out of sort of war. I'm going to get us out of the business of, you know, personally patrolling and occupying the Palestinians. That was popular. It wasn't out of peaceful feelings. It was probably more out of like, we want nothing to do with these people in those places anymore. But you know, unfortunately, in conflicts like this, you know, that sometimes that is at least a way to prevent this, you know, these massive periods of killing. If it's not a resolution of the problem, you know, but it is, I would certainly say it is a preferable state, and it creates conditions where maybe in the future, you know, more significant resolution would be possible. So I don't know what the long-term fallout of this is, and I don't, you know, it may go in unexpected directions. It will remove, I think it will remove, at least for a time, Netanyahu and the current government, and that allows for some possibilities. It will also make it clear to many in Israel that they cannot ignore the Palestinian issue, and that, you know, the idea that the status quo is tenable and is comfortable and is tolerable should have been smashed now. So there will be some in the Israeli public and leadership who will, you know, their conclusion from this will be, we need to do something. Whereas for 20 years it was, we don't know what to do, so we're just going to leave the status quo as is. But the lack of clarity right now on what will be the next, you know, sort of development in Palestinian politics, I think that's really a critical aspect, and that's one that I unfortunately cannot predict and don't think that I know the answer to.
Great, thank you so much. And I mean, I say this at the end of every interview, but I think it's especially true here that there's just so much more that could be talked about with this issue. But I think because of time constraints, and I think we've also covered all the essentials and a lot of good ground, and I think we'll have to probably end the interview here. But I mean, thank you so much for coming on. And I mean, I know this took a long time, so I really appreciate you being willing to take the time to discuss this.